morning, everyone, and welcome to our 11th webinar in our volunteer management webinar series. I appreciate everyone joining. I know it's getting closer and closer to the holidays, and we're getting reports and end of the year things that are all wrapping up. So I do appreciate you guys taking the time to come and listen to me talk about some volunteer management topics. My name is Sydney Shutro, and I'm the Director of Volunteer Services at the Tennessee Commission on Aging and Disability. I do like to preface these webinars in that nothing that we talk about on these webinars is required for you to implement. They're simply best practices through research and kind of personal experience from myself and even some of you who are on the webinar with us. So if you do want to implement anything that we discuss, be sure to loop in your supervisors, your board of directors, or kind of your chain of command, and make sure before you implement anything new that everyone's on board so you can get that buy-in and that support in case you need it. So today we're going to focus on program evaluation and getting volunteers' feedback. Before we do that, we like to start every webinar with a volunteer recruitment tip of the month. And this is one that we've talked a little bit about in the past, but I found a really unique article kind of to put a little spin on it for not only volunteer recruitment, but also a volunteer engagement tool. So we're going to talk about a volunteer-a-thon. And some of us have done this in the past, I think. If not, it's a really interesting way to recruit some volunteers. So in a nutshell, what you want to do is you want to ask your current volunteers to bring maybe 1 to probably no more than 3. You don't want to have a huge, large-scale event unless you can do it virtually, then you might be able to have a higher capacity. But maybe 1 to 3 friends or family members that they think would be really good to volunteer with our programs, whether it be with a certain volunteer role that we have or just a volunteer overall. And you're going to kind of put together an orientation type event to where you go over the basics of the program, the expectations, just in case anyone who attends wants to formally become a volunteer. So definitely have applications on hand, or if you have your applications online, be sure that you share the link with them. It's only going to be about an hour, so it doesn't have to be this huge, long event, maybe hour, hour and a half, depending on if you have snacks or you know, a socialization kind of period. But it's good to have these before you have a training coming up. So if you know you have a training maybe in March, it'd be good to schedule one maybe early February. That way you can get that orientation portion kind of out of the way so volunteers can have a smooth transition into that training process. And it's also a really great way for the current volunteers because they know and they actually recruited those new volunteers to help keep those new people accountable and motivated to volunteer with the program. And maybe they can even volunteer together as a group. And if you have a special project of some kind, you already have a group of volunteers that are close, you know, they communicate often, and maybe they would be really good in helping a project be more successful. The story that I read was published in the Volunteer Management Report. It's like a volunteer journal that I have a subscription to. But it was about the Junior League in Hartford, Connecticut, and they host a volunteer marathon every year that doubles as a large service event as well as a fundraiser. So their idea, and I've modified ours a bit, but their idea was to have a group of people volunteer for 26.2 continuous hours. So a marathon is 26.2 miles, so that's where the 22.6 hours comes from. So I've kind of modified this idea a little bit. Of course, if you want to do a big old volunteer-a-thon, that'd be wonderful. But they did break them up into groups, so it wasn't one person continuously volunteering for 26 hours. That would be very difficult. But maybe a group of 2 or 3 have, or 1 or 2 have a 3-hour volunteer segment, and then another 3 hours and 3 hours and so on. So how I modified it is to kind of be more of an engagement tool for setting a volunteer hour goal of maybe 26.2 hours for the volunteer to complete. And maybe that's on a specific activity, or like delivering meals or doing an exercise class or counseling someone, or maybe it can be a special project like if you have an event coming up and they want to be part of the planning committee or something along those lines. If a volunteer reaches this milestone, maybe they could get a little prize, like a medal or a t-shirt. Volunteers who commit to running this or doing this volunteer-a-thon kind of race of sorts, maybe you can give them a race bib or something like that as well to kind of tie into the marathon theme. This probably is an idea that's just hitting home and hitting real close to me because I'm doing a lot of virtual races. So maybe that's why I probably thought it was a little clever. Maybe you think it's a little silly, but just kind of another spin on how we can also recruit and engage volunteers using this idea. So like I mentioned before, today we're going to focus on evaluation. And I wanted to start off by talking about why evaluation is important. Now, many of us have either conducted evaluations or have been evaluated through our employment. So a lot of this may be refreshers, but I'm hoping that I can sprinkle in some unique methods and that could kind of be fun for us as well. So we already have a long to-do list already. I was just looking at mine this morning and it just keeps getting added to, and I haven't really marked anything off of it. So if you're like me, when you look at your to-do list, evaluation kind of keeps getting pushed to the bottom of the list. So again, it's my hope that we can offer some easy, not so time-consuming, and possibly some fun ways to get an evaluation of our programs done. And as always, I like to include tips and tricks that could not only be implemented in your volunteer program, but other aspects of your job or personal life or things like that. So the first reason why evaluation is important is because we can see what's working. Like, awesome, this is working great. The whole kind of notion of if it's not broke, don't fix it. We can always improve and tweak things a little bit, maybe to make them better. But if you're having really successful volunteer reporting, or if your volunteers are just doing really great on being on time, or whatever is really kind of the shining star, an evaluation is a way to say, this is really working well, and we need to either keep it going or maybe find other ways to make it even better if we can. If not, cool. We have a plus in the positive column. We can also see what needs to be better. So this can be small adjustments. It doesn't have to be a complete overhaul or revamping of anything necessarily, but even the smallest updates or even gestures can make a really big difference in the program. So I kind of use the reporting as a successful thing. It's always been something that I've struggled with in getting volunteers to report on a regular basis, consistent basis. So there's always room, and for me personally, always room for improvement in terms of how to get volunteers to report. And the last thing that's why evaluation is so important is because it's really going to measure the impact that we're having. So we'll talk more about impact next month. That's kind of what our focus of the December webinar is going to be about. But an evaluation is the perfect way that you get to know the impact you're having on the volunteers, as well as the impact that your program is having on the community as a whole. So many of us have a somewhat informal way of getting feedback from our volunteers, which is not a bad thing. You don't necessarily want something formal all the time. You want it to be fun and relaxed and really build that relationship with your volunteers so they're comfortable in giving you maybe some constructive feedback if they're not happy with something. And our programs are luckier than most, and I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here, but because we have a fairly consistent funding source. And now the funding may fluctuate from time to time. We may have one year that's better than another year, but overall, our funding is fairly consistent for our programs. In an unfortunate situation where funding may be cut or maybe programs eliminated altogether, knock on wood, that never happens, but having the evaluation to show the importance of the program is really key if it comes to an elimination period. because volunteer programs are typically on the chopping block, excuse me, are one of the programs that are parts of a program that could be on the chopping block. So having these regular evaluations, knowing what needs to be improved upon, having a strategy of how to improve those things, and also being able to share the impact and the successes is really important in showing the value of our program. So as we talk about different ways to evaluate, I want you guys to focus on 3 different areas. And there could be way more areas to focus on, but I think these are kind of the 3 that we're going to focus on. So we're going to focus on our programs. Just like we mentioned before, we need to know what's working, not working, and the impact that we're having. Many of our programs have specific goals, such as how many people, we counsel on Medicare, how many rides we give to older adults, how many people attend a class, or even how many meals are delivered. So if the goals are being met, part of your evaluation can figure out why do we think that's working? Is there something unique about this year that we just had a super successful way of achieving our goals? Did we do anything unique? Maybe if the goals aren't being met, was there something that happened? Did a global pandemic happen and cause us to maybe decrease on our goals or not be able to counsel or serve as many people just because we've had, volunteers may have been reduced for health concerns, and there's, of course, everyone knows there's a plethora of reasons. But we can also have a justification to our supervisors, our funders, or whoever that, we did do this evaluation, and it's not that we're not doing anything, it's not that our services aren't being provided, it's for XYZ reason, or reasons 1, 2, 3, it's hindered our production in some way. We also need to evaluate our volunteers. Not exactly the most comfortable thing to do, I know, but it is very important. So before I started doing research and really developing this series, I was in the mindset that we should really try and keep volunteers separate from how we would manage like direct reports or how you would supervise someone. However, I do still believe this to some extent. Volunteers are not staff, but at the same time, we do need to have a similar system in place like we do when we have our performance reviews so that we can let the volunteers know what they're doing well. You always want to start with what they're doing well. And then maybe if there's some things that they can improve upon, like, hey, we really need you to report your data the 15th of every month instead of the 30th. We have deadlines for a reason, and these are the reasons why we have those deadlines. But kind of like we talked about, I believe it was, last month or the month before, kind of doing that affirmation sandwich where you start with a positive, talk about what needs to be improved, and then end with a positive. So we're not on the defensive or the attack. We're just trying to help the volunteer understand that we appreciate what they're doing. They're doing an amazing job. They could just maybe improve on this area just a little bit and give some constructive tips on how the volunteer can improve. Or you may not have to have a volunteer improve and you can just praise them all day long. That's great too. The last area that we need to focus on is leadership, AKA us. We need to be evaluated. One way to help volunteers maybe feel more comfortable with us evaluating them is giving them an opportunity to evaluate us. We all get those performance reviews like we've talked about, and it's extremely beneficial, I think, for the volunteers to know what we're doing and how we're doing in terms of engaging them, recognizing them, communicating with them, and so much more. I know whenever I do a survey or an evaluation, I try and take all those compliments and not have a big head, but I also try and take some of those, not criticisms, but some of that feedback and try and improve myself even more. When evaluating all 3 of these areas and more, of course, there's more than just 3 areas, I'm sure. I kind of lumped program into all the different aspects of the program as the name of each and every one of them. We need to avoid taking any kind of constructive feedback or even some criticism. We have those volunteers that like to be blunt and to the point. Try not to take that to heart. We all know that we're doing our best. Our volunteers know that we're doing our best. but there are some areas where we may struggle. So it's not easy, especially if something comes back harsher than intended, but hopefully any feedback is intended to help the program and ourselves improve in some way. Likewise, again, if we have to give feedback to the volunteer, that we stay positive and not confrontational. So evaluation is good, but it's also a little nerve-wracking because you never know what kind of results you're going to get. So try and keep an open mind about it as best you can. Of course, if you have any comments, questions, please feel free to type those in the chat box and we'll address those as they come through. So we're going to be able, through our evaluations, to measure our impact. However you do your evaluation, and we're going to talk about different ways to do evaluations, there's two different types of data that we are going to collect. There's quantitative data and there's qualitative data. So let's start with the quantitative data. Oh, that's hard to say. So it's all about the numbers. This data should be collected throughout the year, and it's a little easier to evaluate. So you'll be able to compare from one year to the next. Have we increased the number of people we served? Have we decreased? Has the number of volunteers increased or decreased? Things like that. So definitely some examples of that quantitative data is the number of volunteers you have, the activity hours, people served, things like that. The data is really impressive. If you're a small program, maybe just in a county, or even if you're a statewide program, some of these numbers that we are able to pull, that we've served so many across Tennessee, is really, really impressive to us. Also impressive to our managers, our funders, even some elected officials. But the numbers alone are not going to show the true impact of the program. That's where we really need, and I'm rough at this. I think every presentation I always say that I'm bad at something. Trying to be honest and upfront. But the qualitative data is something that I struggle with and I'm trying to improve upon. But the qualitative data is really the stories behind the numbers. So the stories are what brings our programs to life. Yes, our managers and funders and elected officials want to know these stories, but the stories can really help attract new volunteers, attract more people that we can serve, and things of that nature. So if you have stories, please feel free to type those into the chat box. I'm going to tell you a story or two, but we all have these stories, and I do want you all to share those with me, especially as we go into next month when we truly talk about impact and kind of promoting successes. We definitely want to collect those stories. So stories that I've come across because of our volunteers have helped people. As you all know through previous webinars, I've worked with the State Health Insurance Assistance Program, or Tennessee SHIP. And our big kind of claim to fame that I like to say all the time is a volunteer helps someone apply for assistance to pay for their medications. And I don't know how many times, and I'm sure any SHIP staff who are on the webinar with us can attest to this, but I don't know how many times people have said, because you helped me with this assistance that I had no idea existed, I'm able to afford my food and medications and my utility bill. And in months previous, they had to go without one of those things. Typically, they had to decide if they were going to buy their medications or their food that month. So helping those individuals apply for assistance to have more money in their pocket to be able to afford things is a wonderful story. We also had a participant in one of our fitness classes who attended the fitness class for about a year, I believe, but they were able to lose over 30 pounds and had been taken off of 3 of their regular medications by their doctor. And so that was just a really great story on how that participant is able to live more independently and has less stress about his overall health. So again, please type in any stories, or we can talk about stories later, but I'd love to hear some of that qualitative data that you all are able to collect over the years. So ways to get our feedback. We're going to talk about 3 main ways, and then we're going to get into a little bit more detail of some ways you probably are already doing, and maybe some creative ways that you can expand in the future. So the first one is interviews. And I struggled back and forth on actually what to call this one because it's really the one-on-one interaction. that you have with your volunteers. So I don't want you to think that, oh my gosh, an interview, I have to sit down, we have to be formal. I don't mean it in that way. I mean it just kind of the one-on-one, maybe informal, just, hey, how you doing? How are things going? That kind of process that you have with volunteers. We're also going to look at some small group activities as ways to get feedback. I would say no more than 10 in a small group, and that may even be too many. So you probably want maybe 5 to 7 maximum as you're talking about small group activities to get the feedback. Too many people in a room, you might have half of them that aren't comfortable speaking out, or maybe 1 or 2 people that dominate the conversation. So try and keep those small groups probably smaller in maybe the 5-person range. And then probably the most common and most popular is we're going to talk about surveying. And it's one of definitely the least time-consuming ways, at least on the front end, in terms of getting it out. The analysis portion can take a little bit longer, but surveys are definitely the most common, I think, and popular ways to get some feedback. And like I said, we're going to go more in depth on all 3 of these areas. So first, we're going to talk about interviews. And again, I just want to stress that I don't mean actual interviews. I just mean kind of that one-on-one interaction. So there's 3 different ways that we can do this one-on-one interaction. So the first one is our screening interviews. We talked about this a couple months ago. So before a volunteer actually starts with the program, it's a great way to have a conversation with them, whether it's through email, phone, in person. I know in person is just kind of a funny thing to say nowadays, but you want to have a conversation with them in some capacity. It's a great way to learn their motivation and assess their skill set to see what volunteer role may be appropriate for them. And you can also see what brought them to the organization. Is there something specific as to why they relate to our cause, our mission, and ways that we can really engage them in the program if we learn a little bit more about them kind of on the front end before they start actually getting into the field. On the flip side of that, and again, I struggle with this, and I'm not sure if you all do, you guys are probably great at this, but I struggle at doing exit interviews. I tend to assume, and we all know what assume means, I won't say it on the webinar, but we all know what it means, that we already know why a volunteer is leaving. Okay, they're moving, they have other commitments, they have families, things of that nature. So having an exit interview is extremely important because even though on the outside, volunteers moving away, okay, we understand they're not going to be able to volunteer with us if they move to another state. However, we can always ask them, it's also a way that we can appreciate them as well. We appreciate everything that you've done. Do you mind scheduling, a 10, 15-minute phone call with me so I can talk to you about what you really enjoyed about volunteering with us, maybe some things that we can improve upon, or if there's anything we might be able to engage you in virtually if they wanted to, continue to work with us just in a different capacity. So hopefully, if you all aren't doing exit interviews, and again, it's just one-on-one conversation. Interview sounds so intimidating and so formal, and I don't mean to do that. But having that conversation with someone who's leaving the program just to get their feedback on some things. So we did have a comment come in. In our program, we're able to use music to engage and connect with a woman who was diagnosed with dementia and withdrawn. From our volunteer testimonials, witnessing this was able to make the volunteer feel like they were making a difference in her life and genuinely felt like she looks forward to their music sessions with her every day. It was exciting to collect the volunteer testimonials, which can serve as qualitative data because it gives context to their experience working with and seeing the therapeutic music intervention work in real time. That is an amazing example of qualitative data. Thank you for sharing that. I look forward to more stories coming in. But you can see just from one interaction, yes, you can get, the data from, she has so much music that she likes to listen to, and this is the music she likes and the genres and things of that nature. But that story of just how the person was able to light up and the impact that it had on the volunteer. Perfect. Thank you so much for that example. It was great. Another one-on-one form of feedback that you can use is kind of on-the-spot talks. So this is good to do after an event, or maybe once a month with a volunteer who comes into the office, delivers a meal, gets a ride regularly. It's good after a volunteer did their first assignment. Maybe you had them go to a health fair, or they did a first call with someone, or they delivered their first meal. Just checking in, hey, how did it go? I know maybe you were a little nervous when you started. Was it as bad as you thought? Is there anything we can do to help make it, less stressful in the future? So just a quick check-in, making sure everything is good. It's really more of a debriefing technique to get some real-time feedback of ways you might be able to help in the short term. And then if you see trends, you can figure out a longer-term strategy on making it successful for everyone and not just individual volunteers. Another idea that many of you have probably seen is a suggestion box. So a lot of us maybe have seen suggestion boxes in person, and it could be good for volunteers to maybe come in the office more regularly. But of course, as we know right now, a lot of offices may be open, but we're limiting the number of people who come in. So there are ways to do virtual suggestion boxes where the volunteer can still remain anonymous. So maybe you use something like Google Forms or Google Docs or a survey system even that we're going to talk about a little bit later. But it will still allow those volunteers to have that anonymity and be able to give their feedback in a constructive, or excuse me, a confidential way. So they will definitely be able to be more honest with their feedback and less timid or reluctant to say how they truly feel. Now, this was a new one that I found in the volunteer management report, and I apologize, it's not a great picture. I tried to take a picture with my phone of the actual magazine, so that's why it doesn't look super great. But there was one organization that does a volunteer annual self-assessment. And as you can see from the example on the screen, it allows the volunteer to take a look back at the previous year and kind of tell themselves, this is what I accomplished. Here's how I did it, how many hours it took, any kind of comments that they have. And then the second part of the assessment is what they're going to look forward to in the upcoming year. So maybe they set some goals for themselves that they want to achieve. It would be wonderful if the volunteer would be willing to share the self-assessments with us. Some of them may want to keep it private, but if they're willing to share their self-assessments, we can help them in achieving that goal, keeping them engaged, giving them the resources and the encouragement that they need to be successful. So that was a unique one that I hadn't seen in the past that I thought might be fun for some of us to implement with our volunteers. This may be for a new volunteer. Maybe this is their first year, and they're like, I did this and this, and they might be thinking about, is this really a good fit for me? But having them give themselves personal goals for the next 12 months or 6 months or 3 months, however duration you want to set, it doesn't have to be a year necessarily, I think would be a really good motivation tool. And can also help you in meeting your goals. If you say, we really need XYZ number of rides, would you be willing to be able to give 20 of those rides or something along those lines? That does it for our individual ways of getting feedback. Now let's talk about some small groups. So the first idea is to do some committees. Now I've been a part of many, many committees, and committees can help get tasks accomplished, but also evaluate how things have been done in the past and new ways that they can improve from year to year. So I know it's extremely helpful to a staff person who's already juggling so many different things, from training, just some ideas of committees. Could be event committee, training committee, recruitment committee, and so many more things that I'm sure you guys can think of. But for example, I've coordinated conferences in the past, and being able to delegate some part of a huge conference to another person is a huge weight lifted off. I remember I ordered the food for a conference one time, and I had 2 volunteers say, hey, we'll make sure everything is set up, and we'll make sure the volunteers, other volunteers get through the lines, we'll clean up, we'll make sure all the food stuff is handled. You just order it and pay for it, and they took care of the rest. That was amazing. And I was able to focus on so many other things, and overall that conference was a huge success. Not that it wouldn't have been a success if I had to deal with the food as well, but I was able to focus on other things, which is extremely helpful. So we're also racking our brains on more ways to recruit volunteers. Why not see if a small group of volunteers wants to develop some ideas, some new ones, or maybe help with strategies that you've already implemented or are currently doing, but take that off your plate a little bit. So we talked months ago that individual volunteers have their own networks that we may not have connections to, or we may not have tapped into in the past. The biggest example I can think of is individuals who are members of faith-based organizations who already have an in with a congregation. It's hard to, if you're not a member of the congregation in many cases, to really get time in front of the people and really get that connection in there. But if you have a committee of volunteers who work on recruitment, maybe they have some really good connections in the community to help with that. While committees are always a great idea, it's extremely important that you are part of the discussion, especially when it comes to recruitment and planning, just to be sure that there's a consistent message being conveyed. So if you're going to recruit volunteers, you want to make sure all expectations are discussed and things of that nature, and volunteers aren't kind of going rogue on, this is how I think the volunteer program is, when we want to keep that message consistent. Evaluation teams. This was a new one that I never thought about in some of my reading, but it's not easy for volunteers to give constructive or even negative feedback to us directly as coordinators or staff of the program. They don't want to disappoint us or anything like that. So maybe creating a team of 2 or 4 volunteers or even coworkers might be a really good way to go about this. To help facilitate small group discussions is a great way for the volunteers to be able to voice their feedback in a slightly more comfortable way. They can stay anonymous, let your evaluation team know, I don't want to know who said what. You don't have to tell me, Amanda said this about you and Nick said that and blah, blah, blah. But just kind of give an overall evaluation of, the volunteers really like that you do this, but they'd like you to improve on this and that. And again, they want to keep us happy and not feel like our volunteers not feel like they're overstepping or telling us how to do our job. However, in reality, the feedback volunteers give is really crucial to us improving as leaders. So we did have a comment come in. It's my understanding the volunteers cannot work remotely. We have no office space for volunteers to come and work in the office. How are we use volunteers if we have no place for them to work? That's a really great question, and it kind of depends on what activities you have. So if you serve a large group of people and maybe they were doing in-person visits with those individuals, maybe instead of doing in-person visits, you see if volunteers want to help with a telephone reassurance program and talk with your current clients and say, hey, I know we haven't been able to see you face-to-face, but we have 2 or 3 volunteers who are willing to give you a call and just check in, make sure you're doing okay. If you have any needs, we can try to address those. But definitely, if you have more questions on that, let's talk one-on-one and see if we can come up with some creative ways that we can get volunteers engaged if they don't have a physical location to go to. Great question. Another idea that came from one of the books that I was reading called the 365 Ideas for Recruiting, Retaining, Motivating, and Rewarding Your Volunteers. And we may come up with a more unique name, but they call it Help Make Us Better Days. So it's a meeting. It could be in person, it can be virtual, it can be however you want to set up this meeting, but it's a way to brainstorm how to make the program more effective. So it's done periodically. This isn't something that you need to do on a monthly basis or even quarterly basis. Maybe it's a once or twice a year kind of meeting, or if you have a new idea, a new project, and you want to get some people's input, these Make Us Better days may be a good way to do that. You also need to preface at these meetings that there's no bad ideas, but also set the expectation that not all ideas may be able to be implemented, or if they are going to be implemented, it's going to take some time. So we want all sorts of off-the-wall ideas, think outside of the box, but that one might be a little too far out of the box, or there's some rhyme or reason as to why we like that idea, we like aspects of that idea. We won't be able to implement it exactly how the volunteer stated it, but maybe we can take bits and pieces of ideas and put something together. So just a way, again, for everyone to come together, get their voices heard. And hopefully if some things are able to be implemented, the volunteers feel even more engaged, and then they want to help you implement the idea kind of that they helped start. The last one for small groups is using your social media. For those of us who are able to use social media in more than, just kind of a posting way, you can engage maybe some of our younger volunteers, possibly with social media groups, to facilitate conversations on certain topics. So if they don't like doing in-person meetings or doing Zoom calls, a lot of, what did one of my coworkers call it, like webinar fatigue or virtual fatigue, because everything's in Zoom meetings and things like that. So maybe you start a Facebook group or whatever it's going to be for your volunteer program, and then once a week or once every month or so, you just start a discussion topic. What do you all think about this? What are ways that I can help you improve in your volunteer activity? I know the office is closed right now. What are ways that you think, or how do you think you could help us volunteer remotely? And maybe get some feedback from the volunteers that way, that, we don't have a physical place for you to come right now, but do you have ideas of ways you may be able to help while the offices are closed? And this should definitely be a private group on Facebook. It shouldn't be something that's kind of out there for the whole world to see. There are ways to make groups private. So I encourage you, if this is something that you're interested in doing, that you have it at kind of a private closed group for volunteers of your program only. And of course, as you get new volunteers, you can invite them in and just continue to build that community. Surveys. We're going to talk a little bit more extensively about surveys because there's multiple layers to surveys. So here we go. Arguably, again, surveys are the most popular way of getting feedback. We use them a lot. I definitely get surveys, probably at least 1 or 2 surveys a week. And it is important that we respond to those surveys because it helps whoever is asking for your input. They think that you're valuable enough that they want your feedback and they want you to tell them how to improve. So hopefully, I know I bombard you guys with a lot of surveys, and I do appreciate all the feedback that you give me in those surveys that I send out at least once a month to you. But we're going to talk about some of the positives and negatives of surveys before we get into kind of how to develop and implement them. So some of the positives, and I'm sure this is a refresher for most of you as well, it allows you to get feedback from a large group of people in a short amount of time. So I know our programs, just from the data that you've all sent in, we have over 3,000 volunteers in our Aging Network program. And I know we have even more than that from programs who may not participate in reporting that data. But if we wanted to get input from those 3,000 individuals, I don't know who's got time to call them or do 300 different small groups of 10. So doing a survey and setting a deadline. Deadlines for surveys are important. Saying, within the next 2 weeks, if you could fill out this survey for me, we'd appreciate it. It's a great way to get a lot of feedback in a short amount of time. Also, the ability to keep people anonymous allows the volunteers to be more honest and upfront with their answers as well. Now, there are a couple downsides to surveys, but in my opinion, the positives definitely outweigh the negatives. but just so kind of we have a balanced scale here. For surveys, it's really hard to answer follow-up questions. So if you had an interesting comment and you wanted to kind of have the volunteer expand on that a little bit more, because it's anonymous, you're not going to know which volunteer said what, or kind of maybe what they intended to say compared to what you interpreted. So that might be where you do a combination of survey and then maybe a small group. Hey, this was interesting. Do you guys have any comments on this or any feedback on this comment? There's generally a low response rate when you do a large scale survey. So as I did my research, there's about a 30% response rate is about average for a survey. And many people don't like open-ended questions, so the results could be limiting if we stick to a lot of the multiple choice, select many options, or click all that apply kind of questions. Even though it's limiting, you're still going to get some good data depending on the questions that you ask. And it's really important that before you create any survey, you ask yourself a simple question. And if you learn nothing else from this presentation, please take this away. If you're going to do a survey, the question you need to ask yourself is, what do you want to learn? If you know what you want to learn from your survey, you're going to be able to determine the questions that you want to ask and how to best format those questions to get the data that you're hoping that you can learn about. So when to survey? There are a few times when it's important to survey just to make sure you're on the right track with things. So training, this is a big one and a really good time to survey at the end of any training you do. That goes for orientation, initial training, update training. You want to make sure that the information you're giving to the volunteers is valuable to them and their volunteer experience, and if they're engaged in what you're talking about. So to answer the questions of what you hope to learn from the survey, you may want to know the materials, were the materials that were presented clearly? Obviously that wasn't a clearly stated sentence, but if the materials were presented clearly, if the volunteer feels confident that they can perform their assigned task, or if we left out any resources that they need, or if there's any other topics they want to learn about, and so much more that you can learn from evaluating a training. Different questions at each level of training, of course. So if you're going to do an initial training, you may not ask, were the materials able, or did the materials help you with your volunteer assignment, because they haven't been assigned or they haven't done a volunteer assignment yet. So that might be something that you follow up with in, an on-the-spot talk or a survey for an additional training that they attend. Are we providing volunteers what they need to be successful? You may also want to add questions about the trainer. So evaluating, again, yourself, and if they were effective in communicating materials. I've definitely become a much better trainer, hopefully you all think so as well, because of the comments that you all give on your feedback and that I've gotten in evaluations in the past. However, I always know, and we always know, that there's room for improvement no matter what. So just in this webinar series alone, I got some constructive feedback that, hey, when you talk about something, make sure you provide an example. And I didn't do that in one of the webinars, so I'm hoping that I've gotten better. And when I talk about things, I give more concrete examples, even showing them on the screen or providing examples in follow-up. You also want to evaluate after an event. So not only, if you can, this would be wonderful, but not only feedback from the staff and volunteers, but also from people who attended the event. So it might be an event for volunteers, and of course you can get their feedback, but maybe you do a community-wide health fair, or you do an expo of some kind. If you can get some input from the people who attended, that can only help improve your event in the future. We would want to know from the staff and volunteers' perspective if they had all the materials that they needed, what worked and what didn't, improvements for next year, things of that nature. So this could be done individually, on the spot talks like we talked about, but ask yourself, will you be able Will you be in the mindset to remember what the volunteer told you? After a big event, I know personally, I am exhausted. I have a million things running through my mind that I may not have the mental capacity to retain the great feedback that I've been given from a volunteer or even a staff person. So I'll be honest and tell the volunteer something like, I really think that's a great suggestion. I don't have anything to write that down with right now. Do you mind sending me an email with that? Or I'm going to send out a survey here within the next day or two about the event. Do you mind reminding me about this comment and putting it on the survey in case I forget? So it shows that you are caring, you really care about what the volunteer says, but at the same time, you're human and your mental capacity, it just isn't there. And personally, I know I wouldn't remember. And the last time of when you should survey is on an annual basis. Many of us already have annual surveys. If you don't, I strongly encourage you to consider creating one, because there are great ways to be able to look back on years past and reflect on the great successes or work through some of the challenges to prepare for the year ahead. Maybe you thought something was a huge failure to the volunteers. It was a good idea, just needs some tweaks, and maybe the volunteers can say, you know, I really thought this was a great idea. It may not have been as successful as we wanted it to, but if we do this, this, and this, we can improve it for next year. So instead of thinking of it as, you know, oh man, this is a complete and total bust or a waste of time, instead of getting down about it, always finding ways to improve. You can also learn about the volunteers' motivations and see if they've changed from their initial interview, or now that most everything has gone virtual due to the pandemic. How has that impacted their volunteer efforts? Are they happy with their role, or does a change? Are they happy with their new role and how it's gone virtually, or just in general in a non-pandemic time? Are they happy in their current role, or maybe does a need to be changed, or a change need to happen? Excuse me. Or it could be a volunteer has a new skill that they want to learn and develop that they don't have yet. So maybe they want to do a different volunteer role to gain more skills. So I'm sure there's other surveys, topics or other times of when we should survey. Like if you're evaluating a new policy or a new initiative. But I do want to stress again the importance of determining what you want to learn from your survey before you start looking at questions to ask or before you send it out. We also don't want surveys to be overwhelming and long. So if they're too long or cumbersome, you may not get any responses or very, very few. So let's take a look at some tips on how to make our program or our survey successful. Man, I am fumbling on words today. I am so sorry. So here's some tips for a successful survey. And this I received from Toby Johnson, who is the founder of Volunteer Pro. It's a really great volunteer management resource. If you all don't know about it, it's really wonderful if you want to take advantage of some of the great resources that she has. So she's got kind of a list of 10 ways to do a successful, more or less volunteer satisfaction survey, but also this can really be applied to any survey that you want to develop. So I kind of did it in groups of 5. So the first one is keep it simple. Definitely you want to have it 10 questions or less, or a survey that only takes a couple minutes is more than enough. It's going to be effective. So you want to keep it simple. This will help you target what you hope to learn and focus on questions that will give you an answer to your question. It will also help when you analyze the responses. The more questions you have, the more you got to analyze. So keeping it nice and simple is key. Also keep it easy. So use the free services, and we're going to talk about some of the services that you can look into here in a little bit. But like SurveyMonkey, for example, with most everything going virtual, sending things out electronically if possible is definitely less time consuming. Or if you need to, maybe volunteers who don't have internet access or who struggle with technology, you can send them a paper copy as well. So try and have the delivery of your survey easy to access. access. Bookend your surveys. Make sure you have an intro and a welcome, what you hope to gain, and when they will hear back from you about next steps. As well as at the end of the survey, make sure you have a thank you to your volunteers for taking the time to complete your survey. So bookend it with an intro and a thank you. Use structured questions as much as possible, like multiple choice questions or, check all that apply questions are likely to get you more responses than open-ended questions. We talked about this a little while ago. And there's always an option that you can add other. So if you have a list of 10 reasons why the volunteer likes to volunteer, you may be able to also put an other category so they can type in any other notes as to why they like to volunteer or answer whatever question you've asked them in their own words. When doing multiple choice questions that where more than one answer can be selected, it's important to have a large variety of options to reduce the respondent burden and make it easier, again, for you to analyze everything. So we'll talk a little bit about how you can expand that variety of options. Ask if they would recommend us, so rate us. It's important to ask if they would recommend our volunteer opportunity to family members, friends, colleagues. This should be done on a rating scale rather than a yes or no. Using a scale will help you track over time if the volunteer feels that their experience is valuable. And you can kind of see the trends from year to year. So if you have a 3.5 rating out of 5 one year, but then it shot up to 4.5, you may be able to see from year to year what you've implemented to help that improve. Additional comments. So this is kind of, we said no open-ended questions or limited open-ended questions. You always want to have at least one opportunity for the volunteers to provide any other comments or feedback that they want to let you know about. So this lets them know that you're open to hearing their candid comments that can add to the questions asked above the survey or expand on something else that wasn't necessarily related to the survey that they want you to know about. Testing is very important. So ask a few volunteers, maybe some coworkers, to test the survey and see if any improvements need to be made. So again, this kind of goes back to the structured questions where if a volunteer tests the survey for you, then maybe they can give you 2 or 3 additional options. Hey, you might want to add X, Y, Z to this question to give people more options on ways to answer. They may also offer wording changes or clarifications that are needed to any of the wording that you have to make it more clear what you're looking for from the volunteer perspective. Defending your results. So the response rates, we talked about this a little bit as well, but you want to be able to defend your results by having a high response rate is important. So the smaller the group, the larger the number of the responses that you need to have. So we're looking at, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, the average is about a 30% response rate. So anything over 30% is going to be a response rate that's going to help you defend those results. So if you have 10 volunteers, you need at least 3 or 4 people to complete it. Of course, higher numbers as the numbers go up. That was just easy math that I could do off the top of my head. But you always want to try and strive for a higher percentage. Prepare for the halo effect. I never knew it was called the halo effect. This is interesting. So we touched on this a lot, that many volunteers are reluctant to give negative feedback. So we can kind of have this sense of everything's amazing, nothing needs to change, I'm doing fabulous, and I'm the best volunteer coordinator that's ever lived. But we kind of have to get out of that halo effect and know that volunteers will likely leave an organization before they voice that they're unhappy with something. That's definitely a trend that's seen worldwide. So after you do a survey, look back on your retention rate and see how this looks compared to the response rates or the responses. So if you notice that you dropped, of course, this is a unique year because it was a pandemic, so that likely is going to contribute as to why volunteer retention may have gone down. But in years that are not in a pandemic, if the surveys come back, that we have a 5 out of 5 star rating, everyone loves our programs, and I communicate the best and all this stuff, but you only had about a 60% retention rate, meaning 40% of your volunteers left. Wonder if that's as accurate, or if volunteers just aren't comfortable with giving that constructive criticism. So kind of look at that and compare. If you have a high retention rate, and keep that halo effect and know that you're doing great. The last one is find a survey and stick with it. So you don't have to change your questions from year to year. If a survey is successful, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. If a survey is successful, when it gets you the information, you need to take action. It's important to keep questions the same to build a baseline of data, and then you can see trends from there. So again, if you want to do a rating system of I would, yes, on a scale of 1 to 5, I would rate referring the program to my friends and family at a 4. So you can see from year to year as the ratings increase or decrease. So you have some consistent questions for that consistent baseline of data. Changing the questions each year will hinder your ability to see if changes you've done in the previous year have made any impact. So those are the 10 survey or tips for a successful survey. A question bank. So this slide's not going to rattle off a million different questions that you can pick from to develop a survey. Instead, I've developed a sample question bank that I sent you all in an attachment to the email that you got yesterday, and I'll attach it again in the follow-up email. So you do have, I believe it's 3.5 pages of some sample questions for surveys. And I do have to confess that these last few weeks have kind of gotten away from me. At the beginning of this week, I was like, oh my gosh, how did it become the 3rd week of November? So it's not as organized as I'd like it to be, or as I had hoped it would be. However, I'm going to work on putting the questions into categories, maybe, training questions, satisfaction questions, stuff like that. I'll figure out whatever kind of categories I'm going to do to make it easier to read. So I hope to have this done at the earliest after the Thanksgiving holiday, but definitely before the next webinar at the absolute latest. But you do have the bank as a resource, so you can kind of go through those questions and see if any of those would be good ones for you to use in a survey. The bank is just the question itself. It doesn't have the options of, on a scale of 1 to 5, it's just simply the question. So again, I apologize, I didn't have as much time as I'd hoped I would have, but I will look at kind of rating systems and maybe some samples of those options for those check all that apply type questions to get you started on some more questions to develop for surveys. If you have any questions that you'd like to add to the bank to help your fellow volunteer coordinators across the state, please send those to me, and I would love to include your input in that bank, and then we just have an ever-evolving resource for everyone to be able to use if they want to do a survey, or even update, screening interviews or exit interview questions, or things that they may want to do the on-the-spot talks with their volunteers about. So hopefully we can get this to be a really great resource. We're going to talk about how to survey. So there are some free electronic survey vendors that you can use. SurveyMonkey is probably by far the one that we hear the most about, so arguably the most popular. So it allows you to create a survey with 10 questions or elements. So if you do want to do an introduction and a thank you, that's 2 of your 10 elements, and you can only have 8 questions to your survey. So it does limit you in a little bit in order to use the system for free. And I believe it also may limit the number of people that you can send the survey to. I'm not sure exactly what that limit might be. If you want additional services, or you want to use additional questions that they have, there is a monthly fee once you get past those 10 elements. But SurveyMonkey, it helps you analyze your data. It can do charts and different things like that for you. So it's a really useful tool if that's something that you're interested in. Another free electronic version that you might be able to use for surveys is Google Forms. I'm not as familiar with this tool. I've used it, or I've done surveys in Google Forms, but I've never actually created a Google Form survey. It seems relatively straightforward, but it doesn't look like there's a limit to the number of questions that you can input. So it might be a way if you wanted to do more than just 8 or 10 questions, you might look at Google Forms. And these are just two of the most cost-effective that I've found. There's dozens of electronic survey vendors out there. Many of them have fees, some don't. I know just these are two that I know are most cost-effective. The state of Tennessee uses FormStack. That's what you guys use when you do surveys for me. But I know we pay a monthly fee for that. And then you can never go wrong with the classic pen and paper, or pencil and paper, however. It's helpful, again, when you have volunteers who are not comfortable using technology, or maybe don't have a computer, or maybe they're in a rural part of the state that has limited to no internet access. So you can always resort to having that paper and pen. It's also good when you have volunteers that are together, maybe when we were able to get back into in-person training, just have them do a survey real quick. But if you do decide to do the paper and pen, and you do decide to mail your surveys to volunteers or whoever you're giving your survey to, make sure that you send that along with a self-addressed stamped envelope for them to return the survey in. So this reduces the burden on the volunteer in returning it. And it also gives them the extra motivation to return it because the program has paid for the postage and they don't want the program to waste any money. So those are kind of three options. Of course, there are definitely more electronic options. Your organization may have their own survey system that they pay for. Whatever you can use, excellent. We did have a comment come in. Google Form is great. Results can go into a spreadsheet automatically. Even if you have paper and pen results, it's easier to enter the data into rather than spreadsheet input. Absolutely, I agree with that. So even if you do use the pen and paper, you can transfer that into one of the electronic formats that you've developed. That way your data is all in one nice and neat location. Thank you, Gina. So one of the last things I want to talk about is we need to make sure that we share the results of our survey. So no matter which technique you use, whether it's individual talks, small groups, surveys, whatever you want to do, you need to share the results with the people you've requested the information from. This could be done in the form of a report. Maybe you do an annual program report that you send to the volunteers or your supervisors or whoever you send it to. Or you may want to have a meeting, an in-person meeting, to follow up on any of the results. So we talked about, or not only an in-person meeting, but also a virtual meeting like a webinar like this, or a conference call, or however you can get a group of people together. So this could also be a follow-up to use that small group strategy. Hey, here's the report. Did you guys notice anything that kind of jumped out at you as, oh, well, that's interesting. I never thought of that, or I thought this would be higher, or surprised this is so low, and try and get the follow-up that's hard to do with a survey. You may be able to get that follow-up in a separate meeting. Last but not least, let's do it. Let's get it implemented if it's a good, solid strategy and idea. No, I don't mean that you implement every little suggestion that a volunteer has. I want to stress that again. I don't mean for you to implement everything. That would be just nearly impossible, and I don't know if I would be able to survive doing that. However, if there's a good, solid suggestion that you can implement, it's a big morale boost for the volunteers knowing that their suggestions were heard and taken seriously. This goes for if it's a staff person that has a suggestion that may be able to help as well. So not just the volunteers, but also include your staff. Some of us work with regional or local staff to implement volunteer programs, and their feedback, again, is extremely and vitally important. So one example of this that I could think of off the top of my head is in the past, as we had our training materials done in all hard copy. So everyone got this big training manual. They were able to write notes in it. They could highlight it. I would always say, you know, muck it up as much as you want. a couple of years into that, a volunteer asked me if we could get the materials electronically so they could search by keyword as they were actually helping people. Well, the document itself was too large to email. So we thought about it, we looked at our budget, and over time we were able to purchase flash drives for each volunteer with the training materials included electronically. And that way they also had a storage space for any updates. If a new version of a manual came out or a new tip sheet was developed, they would be able to save that directly on that flash drive and have everything in one organized location. So not all volunteers liked the flash drive idea. Some did, but that was okay because we still had all of our materials in a hard copy as well. So it was a way that we could improve for some, but also keep what was working, continuing to work for those who like that hard copy. Yes, some ideas might cost a little bit of money, but that one, as we looked through our budget, we thought was definitely well worth the funding that was spent to help our volunteers be able to access the materials in a faster fashion. All right, so to wrap up a little bit, we're going to look at some key takeaways. So remember to convey to your volunteers or whoever you're asking for your feedback from why it is important that we get their input. So, you know, we really want to improve this, or we really want to make sure that we keep you engaged, or, you know, whatever the importance, whatever question you want answered. You know, we want to know if it works, we want to know how we can improve, and we want to know the impact. So make sure that they know why the survey is important for the program as a whole. Collect those stories. So the stories behind the numbers are really important. Amanda gave us a great story. I gave a couple. Here's one more that I thought was really great. So having 50 volunteers who help 3,200 older adults do 66,000 hours of exercise is really impressive to our funders, and they love that information. But knowing that because someone attended a class, they were able to reduce the number of medications they were taking, they no longer needed to use a cane or other assisted device to walk because their strength had improved so much, or they were more confident and able to see their family and friends because they were not afraid of falling, really shows the impact of our program. So if we can not only show people the numbers, but show those stories behind the numbers, we can really show our impact. Use multiple methods of evaluation if you can. Surveys are great, again, less time consuming, but those follow-ups with the small groups aren't a bad idea, or even having individual talks with people on a semi-regular basis can really help get in-time feedback on little things that you may need to improve. That way, at the end of the year, when you compile all of the data, you're not overwhelmed with, oh, I wish I would have done this or that, you know, back in March. You can gradually do it and say, oh, I did that in March, you know, and that helps a little bit. Maybe we can improve that even more going forward. And then last but not least, don't forget to share the results and the feedback that you're given, and do your best to implement the suggestions that are manageable. Again, you don't have to implement every suggestion, but things that are manageable to you, or even if you're able to get a small group of volunteers to help you in implementing some new ideas. So let it be known that the results are good. Even let it be known if the results are bad. Don't be hard on yourself if a critique comes in. Twist it into a positive, that, you know, that is something I need to work on, and I'm going to work on it. And then the next year when you have the surveys and you can see that whatever scores or improvements that you've done, you can give yourself a pat on the back. So that concludes the part of the webinar that's going to talk about program evaluation. I do have a couple updates I want to share with you guys real quick. But please feel free to type in any questions that you have now, and after I'm done with the updates, we can go back to any questions that you have before we wrap up completely for the day. So normally during this section, I give you numbers about the volunteer campaign and how great we're doing. And I just have to thank you guys so much again for those of you who have participated with that. Our numbers are continuing to increase. We have, like I said earlier, over 1,000 or 3,000 volunteers across the state. But I wanted to focus on a couple different updates this time. So our Make a Difference Monday campaign has been a tremendous success because of all of you. We have all of our slots needed for 2020. So we have a volunteer that has been highlighted every Monday of 2020, with the exception of 2 Mondays that our Facebook page was down. But other than that, we have a volunteer that's going to be highlighted every Monday of this year. So huge, huge thank you to all of you for participating in that. I don't think, however, that campaign of highlighting individual volunteers is going to be sustainable through 2021. So instead, we're looking at focusing on volunteer programs each month rather than individual volunteers. So definitely after doing the research, I'm learning more and more what I'm not doing correctly, or what I guess shouldn't say what I'm not doing right, but what I'm going to improve on for next year. So, you know, do as I do, not as I say. So we have started to collect stories from the campaign that we can use in promoting volunteer recruitment. And we're definitely going to be working with all of you at the regional and local levels, as well as people up at the state levels in terms of staff, to develop some materials to help with promotion. And I think it's going to be a much better way to increase volunteerism in 2021. So we can't guarantee that a program will be highlighted each month necessarily, but we do want to encourage you that if you have a training coming up or any strong need for volunteers, to let me know. We can develop some materials and we can get it kind of out on our social media platforms and see if we can help volunteer recruitment in 2021. So hopefully that's a little bit better of a strategy than doing individual volunteers. So again, it was extremely successful this year. So I thank you all so much again for that. But I think we're going to sort of shift strategies to focusing on the program, even though we'll still use the volunteer component. I mean, again, we're still going to use those testimonials and the stories that the volunteers gave us, but we're going to focus more on the program rather than the person. The second update that I have for you guys is I wanted to share that the Council for Volunteer Administrators has released information for the Certified Volunteer Administrator Certification Exam window for 2021. So this is an international volunteer certification, kind of the only credential for volunteer managers, or they call them volunteer administrators, kind of interchangeable names. Personally, I will be retaking the exam in April 2021. So unfortunately, I didn't pass my exam the first attempt. That shouldn't say anything about the exam. I have major test anxiety, so I think that played a huge role. But the test is $350. And you can see there's 2 different exam windows, April 1st to the 14th and October 1st to the 14th. Applications are due in March and September in order to sit for the exam. There is informational sessions that are going on December 1st. There's actually an informational session going on right now, so I apologize if you guys know about this and wanted to be on the webinar, but you decided to be with me instead. I appreciate it. But December 1st, there's another informational webinar about the certification program and all the different steps. And again, on January 25th, if it's something that you're interested in. To be eligible, you do have to have at least 3 years of full-time volunteer resource management experience. And the 3 years can be broken up into, 6 years of part-time work, or however you can do that. Also, currently, your current position should be at least 30% related to volunteer management. And there's also an educational experience component that you'll have to fill out. But there's so many resources on their website. It's listed there on the screen. They have study guide materials, study questions. There's a Facebook group that does a study hall starting, I believe, in January or February. So I just wanted to let you guys know that this is available. This is not a requirement by any means for anyone to do. Just something I thought you guys would be interested in learning about. And if anyone is interested, maybe a small group of us could form a study group and we can kind of encourage one another to get certified. If you're interested in that, let me know, and I'll be sure to get a group together and we can have some study sessions. But again, no obligation. Just wanted to make sure that everyone was aware that that was out there. Lastly, after doing this presentation on how to do surveys, I realized that the survey I ask you guys to do every month isn't the best, and I definitely want to revamp it. So I don't have a survey for this month's webinar. However, I do plan on creating a survey to help me plan for the 2021 series. So definitely keep an eye out for that for me when we return from the Thanksgiving holiday. Our next webinar, last one of the year, is going to be Friday, December 18th, same time, same place, hopefully wherever you're at. And we're going to talk about promoting your program and volunteer successes. So again, I know it's getting close to the holiday break, and everyone is going to get a much deserved break here in a few weeks. But I hope you all will be able to join me next month as well. So with that, thank you guys so much for taking time to be with me today on the webinar. And if I don't talk to you all before, I hope you and your families have a safe, healthy, and happy Thanksgiving. So with that, I don't see any questions that have come in, but I'm happy to stick around and answer any questions that you have. So thank you guys so much again for always supporting me with this series. It means a lot to me.